December 11th, 1944. High above the winter line, the eagle's nest felt less like a headquarters and more like a sealed tomb carved into rock. Inside the bunker corridors, concrete swallowed sound, and every door carried the weight of fear disguised as authority. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stood against a bare wall with his hands raised. Beside him stood Field Marshal Walter Model and General Hasso von Manteuffel, three of the most powerful commanders in the German West. Men trained to treat rank as sacred were being handled like suspects. The SS were not polite. They were deliberate. Sidearms were taken away. Pockets were searched. Briefcases were torn open and pawed through as if papers could be weapons. The humiliation was staged carefully, and everyone in the room understood what it meant. This was not security. This was ownership. In late war Germany, even field marshals could be treated like criminals because Hitler's system no longer trusted professionalism. It trusted loyalty. It trusted fear. It trusted the men in black uniforms who carried ideology like a club. No one shouted. That silence made it worse. The air was thick with fury held behind teeth. These were old Prussian aristocrats, men who valued honor as much as breath, and now they were being patted down by political thugs. The SS wanted them to feel it. They wanted them to remember it. Then the inner door opened, and Adolf Hitler appeared, not as the triumph from posters, but as a trembling figure surrounded by concrete. His body looked small in the bunker world, but his voice still tried to fill it. He spoke as if he were unveiling a miracle. This was his master stroke, he insisted. Operation Watch on the Rhine. The gamble that would become the Battle of the Bulge. He painted it with confidence because he needed confidence to survive himself. 200,000 German soldiers would smash through the Ardennes, rupture the Allied line, seize Antwerp, and split the coalition. The port would choke Allied logistics. The British and Americans would be cut apart like a rope snapped in the middle. He promised victory as if the promise itself could make it real. Then he reached for contempt, because contempt is easier than calculation. The Americans, he said, were cowboys and playboys. They would panic at the first shot. They would break and run like they had at Kasserine Pass. He spoke as if the war had not changed since 2 years ago, as if America's learning curve, its factories, its replacements, and its air power were irrelevant details. Von Manteuffel said nothing. His face remained controlled, but his mind was not comforted. He had fought the Americans. He had watched them adapt. He knew they could be clumsy, yes, and sometimes overconfident, but he also knew they were stubborn and deep and improving faster than Germany could. Hitler was building the plan on an enemy frozen in time. Von Manteuffel knew the enemy was not frozen. The enemy was becoming something else. But the biggest German mistake in this story wasn't only the Ardennes gamble, it was something subtler, something that would take decades to reveal. Because for decades after the war, the world was fed a neat story, a flattering story for Americans, a pride-saving story for Germans, a story largely written by the German generals themselves. In memoirs and interviews, German commanders claimed they had feared George S. Patton from the beginning. They claimed they tracked his every move from North Africa to Normandy. They claimed his name haunted their staff rooms. They claimed he was the one Allied general who kept them awake at night. It was a convenient legend because it fit Patton's image. Loud, aggressive, theatrical, fast. And it helped German officers explain defeat in a way that did not feel like a confession of failure. If you lost to a legend, you did not lose to inevitability. If you lost to Patton, you did not lose to an IBC industrial machine. It worked. until historians opened the documents written while the bullets were still flying. When researchers cracked open the daily intelligence files from 1944, they expected to see Patton's shadow everywhere. Instead, they found empty space. In February of 1944, months before D-Day, German intelligence prepared profiles on senior Allied commanders expected to lead the invasion. Eisenhower, Montgomery, Bradley. Omar Bradley's file was thorough. Montgomery's was exhaustive. Patton's file did not exist. Not a weak file. Not a mistaken file. Nothing. Until late summer of 1944, Patton barely appeared. There was no obsession, no documented fear, no evidence that German planners were building decisions around him. The man they later claimed to fear most had been ignored. That discovery forces a sharper question than any legend can answer. If German intelligence wasn't watching Patton, then how did he become the commander they later claimed had terrified them? How does someone go from invisible to nightmare? And if they weren't watching him, who were they actually watching? The answers came from post-war interrogations, sessions run by American Army historians and also shaped by the British writer Basil Liddell Hart. Captured German generals were questioned for years about how they evaluated Allied leadership, not in the language of propaganda, but in the language of assessment. Who was predictable? Who was dangerous? Who was respected? Who was dismissed? One Allied commander drew genuine contempt, Mark Clark, who commanded the Fifth Army in Italy. Clark was photogenic, obsessed with image, and surrounded by publicity. German officers viewed that vanity as weakness because vanity creates predictability. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, German commander in Italy, suggested after the war that Clark would choose the option that produced the best headlines. Military logic was secondary to personal glory. They pointed to the breakout after Anzio in May of 1944. Clark had an opportunity to cut off and destroy the retreating German 10th Army. Destroying an entire army is not just a victory, it changes the war. But Clark turned toward Rome. He wanted to be the liberator of the first Axis capital. He wanted the photographs, the headlines, the glory. Rome fell, the cameras flashed, and the German 10th Army escaped to fight again. The cost was paid later by infantrymen still dying in northern Italy against units that could have been trapped. The pictures were beautiful. The consequences were not. German staff officers quietly admired what that vanity gave them. A commander who could be read like a newspaper headline before it was printed. Bernard Montgomery was predictable for a different reason. German generals didn't always hate him. Many simply believed they could forecast him. Montgomery was systematic and cautious. He wanted overwhelming superiority before he attacked. That method can win battles, but it can also broadcast intentions. German officers believed they knew his formula. Build up, bombard, advance deliberately, halt at nightfall, consolidate, repeat. If you could move faster than Montgomery could prepare, you could slip away before his hammer fell. General Gunther Blumentritt reportedly demonstrated Montgomery's style in an interrogation by walking across a room in slow, measured steps. No sudden movement. No risk. That, he said, was Montgomery. Careful, deliberate, and therefore beatable through speed and redeployment. The Germans believed Montgomery gave them time. Operation Market Garden was the exception. Montgomery abandoned caution and gambled on a bold airborne thrust to seize bridges over the Rhine. It was dramatic and aggressive, and it failed. Thousands of Allied casualties, airborne units isolated and shattered, and Germany earned a grim satisfaction. The one time Montgomery tried to be something else, he proved why his caution existed. Yet not all British commanders drew criticism. Harold Alexander, commanding the 15th Army Group in Italy, earned genuine professional respect from Kesselring. Alexander was flexible where Montgomery was rigid, diplomatic where Montgomery demanded control. He managed a coalition force: Americans, British, Canadians, Free French, Poles, Indians, Brazilians, and more, each with different doctrines, equipment, and politics. Holding them together required humility and adaptability, not just force. German commanders respected Alexander because he understood coalition warfare. He used strengths instead of forcing everyone into a single mold. He let subordinates exercise initiative. That made him harder to predict. Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, was judged harshly by many German generals in a different way. They recognized his organizational genius and the difficulty of managing an alliance, but they often described him as a coordinator rather than a battlefield commander. They criticized his broad front strategy, advancing everywhere rather than concentrating on a single decisive blow. In their view, a concentrated thrust toward Germany's industrial heart could have ended the war sooner. Instead, Eisenhower kept everyone moving and, in their interpretation, kept everyone satisfied. They said he thought like a politician, excellent at unity, less decisive in killing blows. In that framing, he gave Germany months more to fight. Omar Bradley was assessed as competent, methodical, and professional. He did not chase publicity like Clark or cultivate a dramatic persona like Patton. German officers respected him but did not mythologize him. Bradley applied pressure steadily, backed by massive resources, and rarely made catastrophic mistakes. He was not spectacular. He was effective. Courtney Hodges, commanding the American First Army, represented something even more unsettling. German generals struggled to describe him personally because what they remembered was not the man. It was the machine. They fought the First Army in Normandy, around Aachen, in the Hurtgen Forest. They bled against it. But when interrogators asked about Hodges, many Germans could barely say anything specific. The army itself felt impersonal and unstoppable. Von Manteuffel described the Americans as fighting like a machine, relentless, industrial, and endless. Ammunition, air superiority, replacement troops, replacement tanks, replacement everything. When one unit was destroyed, another appeared. German commanders had spent years studying personalities, looking for weaknesses. Against the American system, personality mattered less. You could outsmart a man. You could not outsmart a factory. That was the deeper fear. The fear that war had become something Germany could no longer match. And then Patton entered German reality, not as a rumor, but as a force that shattered planning. Before D-Day, German intelligence largely ignored him. They assumed he had been sidelined after the slapping scandal. They did not profile him. They did not track him like they tracked other senior commanders. That assumption collapsed in late summer of 1944. Patton's Third Army broke out of Normandy and moved with a speed that made German maps worthless. Front lines drawn in the morning were wrong by afternoon. Planning cycles collapsed. German commanders struggled to believe reports of how quickly American formations were advancing. No army, they thought, could move that fast. Yet Patton did, and the psychological effect mattered almost as much as the territorial gains. Speed does not just seize ground. Speed destroys certainty. After the war, Rundstedt's assessment changed completely. When asked who was most dangerous, he did not hesitate. Patton was your best, he said. Not one of your best, your best. German officers compared Patton to their own masters of maneuver, like Guderian, because Patton thought in sweeping operational movements rather than slow grinding. Kesselring suggested Patton had turned armored warfare into something like an art. and compared his instinct for momentum to the best maneuver commanders Germany had faced. German generals noted another difference. Many Allied commanders would allow surrounded German units to escape. Patton would not. He pressed harder, chased longer, exploited every crack. Against Patton, retreat could become destruction. The moment that burned Patton into German fear, however, was the Ardennes offensive itself. German planners assumed the Americans would need roughly 2 weeks to respond to the sudden winter assault. They believed the shock would buy time. Patton broke that math. He pivoted major forces and attacked within roughly 48 hours, driving toward Bastogne in conditions that were supposed to slow everyone to a crawl. For German commanders reading the reports, it felt like physics had been rewritten. An entire army shifting direction and moving through winter roads so fast was not only a maneuver, it was a shock. It meant their assumptions were wrong. It meant their timing was wrong. It meant their gamble was being countered before it could mature. Imagine the panic inside German command centers. The maps said they had time. The timetables said the Allies would be slow. And then, through snow and fog, American engines appeared where the Germans expected emptiness. The roar of Shermans in places that should have been silent. The sense that the war's tempo had changed into something Germany could not control. After that, German commanders stopped underestimating Patton. They had learned what happened when you dismissed the gladiator. Yet Patton was not the only American commander German generals described with genuine fear. There was another name that rarely became a headline: Lucian Truscott. Truscott never gained Patton's fame. He never became a symbol. But in Italy, German commanders noticed him with a clarity that suggests respect. In February of 1944, Truscott took command of 6th Corps at Anzio after the beachhead had stagnated under General John Lucas. For weeks, German forces contained the landing. The front was static. The Americans were pinned. Then Truscott arrived, and the posture changed. German staff officers reported that American operations had suddenly stiffened. The same units now felt aggressive. The same positions now probed and pushed. Attacks came sooner. Movement felt sharper. Nothing had changed except the commander. Truscott believed in brutal tempo. His troops trained to march faster than normal doctrine allowed, a pace often called the Truscott Trot. It blistered feet and exhausted men, but it created a lethal advantage. It stole time from the enemy. If you move faster than the enemy can react, you win. If you slow down, you give defenders the one thing they need: time to think, reposition, and survive. German commanders recognized that as real tactical excellence. Truscott did not seek fame, but he was dangerous because he understood mobility the way Patton did, without the theatrics. After the war, when German generals listed Allied commanders who genuinely concerned them, Truscott's name appeared alongside Patton. Not Montgomery, not Bradley, not Clark. The professionals recognized a professional. When you step back and look at the pattern, the German ranking of Allied commanders becomes a confession. It wasn't about who was nicest or who made the best speeches. It was about who was most dangerous to German survival. Clark, they implied, offered opportunities because vanity made him predictable. Montgomery offered time because caution created rhythms that could be anticipated. Eisenhower, in their harsh view, offered months because he managed unity more than decisive concentration. Bradley and Hodges offered a grinding death, backed by an industrial system that could not be exhausted. Alexander earned respect because flexibility made him hard to read. Truscott earned fear because tempo killed. Patton earned fear and admiration because speed, aggression, and relentless pursuit collapsed German planning. And that is why the myth had to be written after the war. It was easier for German generals to say they had feared Patton all along than to admit they ignored him until he forced his way into their reality. It was easier to build a legend about one terrifying man than to admit they were being crushed by something impersonal. American production, logistics, air power, replacements, and a system that learned faster than Germany could. The daily intelligence files from early 1944 expose the uncomfortable truth. German planners were preparing to fight the commanders they understood, not the momentum they could not yet imagine. They profiled Eisenhower, Montgomery, Bradley, because those names fit their categories. They ignored Patton because they believed scandal had removed him from the center stage. They were looking in the wrong direction. Then August came, and the war's tempo changed. Patton moved too fast for their maps. Truscott pushed too hard for their assumptions. The American machine rolled forward with a depth Germany could not match. The bunker world of honor and pride and internal humiliation collided with the external world of fuel, steel, and relentless logistics. So when you picture that bunker on December 11th, 1944, Rundstedt, Model, and von Manteuffel being searched like criminals, Hitler insisting the Americans were cowboys, you can feel the tragic mismatch. Hitler was betting on contempt and drama. He was gambling on an enemy he wanted to be weak. But the truth was already moving toward him through snow and fog. The fear German generals later described was real, but it arrived late. It arrived when their assumptions were already shattered. It arrived when their planning cycles could not keep up. It arrived when the enemy proved it could do the impossible. Pivot fast, strike fast, replace fast, and keep coming. That is the real suspense, hidden beneath the legend. Not the question of whether the Germans feared Patton, but the question of why they needed to pretend they always had. Because admitting they were not watching the right threat is admitting they were already losing before they understood why. And once you understand that, the story becomes sharper and darker. The German High Command did not just gamble in the Ardennes. It gambled with its own understanding of the war. It gambled on stereotypes. It gambled on old memories like Kasserine. It gambled on the belief that willpower and contempt could replace reality. Reality answered with speed, with pressure, with endless supply, with commanders who did not always look like legends until they made German calculations collapse, with a machine that did not need myth to win, only momentum. And in that future, cold, industrial, relentless, the old world professionalism the German generals clung to had no shelter. Not even inside the concrete walls of the Eagle's Nest.